So before we talk about competition among advisors, let's give a background to China's going out as a phenomenon. In roughly the year 2000, the People's Republic of China, the government announced that they would be encouraging certainly state-owned enterprises and providing incentives to non-state-owned enterprises to go out and invest outside of China. That's known as the going out policy. And we see that in the first waves of going out, state-owned companies were investing in assets, securities, loans, but also merging with foreign counterparts for a number of reasons which we reference in the paper, but which we won't really go to in this presentation. And as mentioned, there were many types of going out investment, and for the purposes of our study and for this presentation, we will be focusing specifically on mergers and acquisitions. Turning our attention to figure 12, which we see on the slide, we compare the extent of M&A activity in the three largest jurisdictions in the world, not treating the EU as a jurisdiction. We see the average value of transactions which were managed by M&A advisors in the top 10, and we see differentiation among the average values of those M&A transactions for target companies and acquirers, and the legal advisors and financial advisors which advise those companies. So what we see is that Japan has a relatively equal allocation of deal sizes between legal and financial advisors, with legal advisors making up slightly more than financial advisors. And in the US, we see that the proportion is slightly more focused toward financial advisors. In the Chinese context, we see that they're roughly equally balanced. So we see overall that average value sizes in China exceeded those deal sizes in the US and Japan during the period that we look at in the paper, suggesting that if you want to look at where the action is at, China is a very good jurisdiction to look at. Naturally, the map right below that figure shows the geographical distribution of Chinese investment, and you'll see many more references to such distribution in the paper. And most papers describe mergers and acquisitions as a phenomenon. They talk about M&A flows and they talk about what drives M&A flows. But they don't look at the very important role that M&A advisors themselves play in this process. And so rather than focusing our discussion today on those M&A deals, we're instead going to turn the focus and ask, well, who were the advisors that worked on these M&A mandates? How did they profit? What did they do to profit from these large deal flows? And what can other companies learn? And of course, what can academics learn from this whole process? And as I mentioned previously, it's these mega M&A flows coming out of China that allows us to see the way that advisors' competitive strategies are changing relative to these deal flows. And you can almost think about it as surfing the rapids, which you see in the figure. For very weak flows, water flows in the case of rapids, it's very difficult to see how the boats will change depending on different factors, depending on whether there's rocks in the tide and so forth, to overuse this analogy. But if those flows are very voluminous, then we can see very clearly, even for relatively small changes in our variables, how advisor strategies are changing without resorting to all kinds of crazy, exceedingly complicated econometric techniques, which usually confuse both non-academics and academics alike.